feel free to join in if you know the Nama Tassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Buddham Dhammam Sangham Namasami. As I mentioned earlier, our topic for the day is the 4 kinds of courage. Actually 5, since I gave you another kind of courage earlier today, which is the courage to be present for what is. And as I go through, I hope to draw a thread of the path of practice as a whole, as something that you can walk throughout your life. So the 4 kinds of courage that I'm going to speak about in this particular talk are the courage to be upright, or sila, ethics, the courage to be kind, or metta, which is one of the sublime abidings. The courage to rest in emptiness, samadhi, or concentration. Sometimes it's translated as concentration, or I prefer something collectedness, mind and body. And then the courage to awaken, courage to attain liberation. So the first of those, the courage to be upright. It's about resisting the exploitation of people and things, including oneself, including the earth, including people that work for you. I would suggest that it takes sometimes a willingness to stand against. It's different than a lot of what you encounter in the world. My daughter lives in Washington, D.C., or just outside of D.C. these days. And when I went to go visit her in December, we went to visit the African American. And we spent a couple of days there to really take it in. And maybe some of you have been there. The lower floor is below ground level. Very low ceilings, all painted black. Because it's made to look like the basement of the ships in which the slaves were brought across this country. This dark, heavy space. On the wall they had shackles. Shackles for adults and shackles for children. Because these people were chained to the floor And at that time, that was part of life. That was understood to be the way that things worked. We now know better, though we still live with the shadow of this country. Another example is Driscoll's. I was just talking to my fabulous hostess, Dana, and her partner, Tom, about the boycott that's going on. Farm workers who are paid $6 a day for a 12 to 14-hour shift. That's why their berries are cheaper. So to live an ethical life is to stand upright in a place of making choices that don't exploit anything or anyone. And it may seem like that's an easy thing to do in your life until you actually start thinking about it. Usually it takes quite a bit of presence of mind to live that way. So why do it if it takes so much effort? If you're going to end up disagreeing with your neighbor, perhaps. Well, for one thing, you get to look yourself in the mirror. You get to sleep at night because you know that you're living that kind of life. The Buddha said that's the primary benefit of living an ethical life, of being upright, is to be free from remorse and regret. Because you probably have experienced that. You sit down on your cushion and maybe that regret comes up about that thing that you said to someone, and that thing that you did, that choice that you made. It's going to come up. So when I first started practicing Buddhism, I had been raised in a Christian tradition. And so I thought, oh yeah, all that ethics stuff, that's just people telling you to be a good girl or a good boy or a good person of whatever gender you happen to be, and just a bunch of rules. And yet over time, I came to realize the truth, the other truth that the Buddha said about an ethical life, which is that it is actually developing a culture of fearlessness. When people know that you are living upright, when people know that you are not looking to exploit them, then they will be more trusting with you. They'll be more honest with you. They'll be more naturally inclined to take care of you when things get rough. So giving the gift of fearlessness begins with standing upright in your place, in your ethical place in life. And it also creates a certain clarity of mind. That's the other benefit that the Buddha said very clearly. He said, living a life of ethics is actually the foundation for any sort of concentration. You can't get there without going through that, without living that way, without taking those steps. In part because you need to develop your own view of yourself as a worthy person in order to give yourself the gift of practice. The Buddha went through this, surprisingly, all the way up until the last moments before he was awakened. Some of you maybe know the story of the Buddha touching the earth. Right? So there he is, he's sitting under the Bodhi tree. He's made the determination that he's going to awaken. He's been practicing hard for years and years. And then Mara approaches him and says, who the heck are you to wake up? Why do you deserve to wake up? So whether you understand Mara to be an actual being, or you understand Mara to be the Buddha's own shadow, either way, he had to answer that question. Why did he deserve to wake up? And in response, he did this mudra of touching the earth. Meaning simply to be a human being is to be a demonstration of what's good and what's right. If we are willing to stay out of harm's way, if we are willing to be clear about the choices that we make, if we are willing to set down our delusions about what that means. So he touched the earth as his witness. Yeah. Just to be a human being doing this practice is enough. But you can't just tell somebody, and you actually have to live the practice in order to know that that's true. Because my telling you might help, but it's not actually what's going to make it possible for you to sit there and do that. You have to know it in your own heart. So that's pamoja. Pamoja is a kind of joy. The Buddha talked about many kinds of joy in the Dharma. It's funny because oftentimes there's this perception that all he talked about was suffering. He did say that that was his goal, the elimination of suffering. But he actually did talk about a lot of different kinds of joy. One kind of joy that he talked about was the joy of knowing the good that you've done. It's called pamoja. It's the pat yourself on the back Dharma. The Buddha actually said, do that. It's good for you. It's good for you. To remind yourself of the things, the good things that you've done. Like coming here and ringing the bells, or washing the dishes, or setting up the cushions, or offering the food, or any number of other good things that you're doing in life that help to bring a compassionate and wise world into being. Remember that. Remember that. Encourage yourself in that way. And finally, this kind of what I think of as eliminating some of the hustle and the hassle. Because if you're living unethically, then I guarantee you that some of your mind space is going toward dealing with the consequences of that and covering up the consequences of that and wondering who knows and who doesn't know and when you're going to get it. One way or another. This is what the Buddha referred to as dark karma in this life, or kamma. So I tend to bounce back and forth between our monk, Pali and Sanskrit and Japanese, and so I hope you all forgive me or raise your hands if I'm saying some terminology that doesn't sound familiar. But reducing the actual karmic consequences that are happening right now. So this is courage. This is courage to be upright. This is courage to start that foundation of having a mind that is clear enough to begin to do some of the deeper work. And the next part that I wanted to talk about was metta. So kindness, courage to be kind. Metta is one of the 4 sublime abidings. So usually when we talk about, there's the 8-fold noble path, or there's the 3-fold path, sila, samadhi, panya. There's ethics, mental development, and wisdom. And I put metta in between those first two because it's also understood as a practice which helps in the development of the mind, which helps in the development of concentration itself. But kindness, I would suggest to you, is one of the bravest things you can do in many places in the world today, including in this country. To really live as a kind person. It's seen oftentimes as a weakness. But I think that when I have seen people who know how to live in a kind place, their boundaries are just as clear as anybody else's. I'll give you an example. There's a woman named Antoinette Tuck. You all know who that is? She lives very close to here, just east of Atlanta. She was, in 2013, she was working as a bookkeeper for an elementary school. School had just started a few weeks before, and she was there at the front desk because the receptionist had gone on break. And a young man walked in with an AK-47, 500 rounds. And started shooting into the ceiling and threatening her and everybody in the school. So what did she do? She lived up to her name. She lived up to her name. She started talking to him. And she started telling him all of her problems. She started telling him all about how her husband wanted to divorce her after many, many years of marriage, about her disabled son, about her bouts of depression. She just talked to him like a human being. And she asked him, "What's going on with you? Why do you want to do this?" He started to walk down the hall toward the kids' classroom. She said, "No, come back. I haven't finished telling you my story." And she talked to him and asked him till she convinced him to put the gun down and to lie down on the floor and surrender to peace without having shot a single person. And when she was asked how it was that she had the courage to do such a thing, she said, "Well, I learned it in church. In church I was told you should treat everybody like a human being. Kindness." So don't tell me that kindness is a weakness. Kindness can be equally strong. Can be equally strong as aggression. Sometimes more so. But you have to be willing. You have to be willing to relinquish your grudges. You have to be willing to relinquish your need to be right. You have to be willing to see the other person as a human being, no matter what they believe. The Buddha set the bar very high. He said even people who speak to you harshly, even people who want to harm you, even somebody who cut you up with a saw, should be treated kindly. Set the bar pretty high. And again, I think that this is giving the gift of fearlessness. When people encounter you as a person who will be kind, even when you disagree, then they can be authentic. You will find a certain kind of trust. The Buddha said the benefit of kindness is to be free from ill will in your own heart. Be free from ill will. Can you imagine? A heart completely free from illness. And I want to suggest also that there's something there about choosing your channel. Choosing your channel. When I worked in hospice, one of the things, I was a spiritual care chaplain in hospice, home hospice, for a short period of time, about a year and a half after I did a year of hospital chaplaincy training. And I would go to people's homes or to various institutions, institutional settings, various kinds of senior housing, and encounter people in whatever state of dying they were. Some of them were very close in hours dying, some of them were months and months away. Sometimes were years. But one thing that I noticed is that the folks who had some kind of mental compromise, folks who had dementia or the ways in which they had gotten foggy, were often on one channel. They were stuck in a particular tone of mind. So if their lives had been completely dominated by anger, they were angry all the time. They didn't even have a choice about it anymore. And if their lives had been kind and generous, then they were kind and generous no matter who walked in the room. It didn't matter if they never met you before. On my last day of working in hospice, I was going home. I was actually going back to the office, the main office of the hospice that I worked for, to give the computer back. And so, and one of my fellow hospice workers was out that day. She was out sick. And one of her patients was in crisis, or so we thought. The nurses had called and said, she's within 24 hours of dying and somebody should come and say a prayer for her or do something. And because this was my friend's patient, I didn't know this person at all, but it was on my way back to the office, which was not my normal way of going home, but that's where I was going. So I told my friends, my other chaplain friends, well, okay, I'll go and I'll visit with this woman. So she was in a nursing home in a facility in downtown Oakland, California. Small Jewish woman. Mind you, Judaism is probably the faith about which I know the least. But in any event, it's time to go see her. So I walked in and I went up to the nursing desk and explained why I was there. And she said, well, we're not really sure anymore whether she's that close or not. But you go on in there and see what you do. So for me, this was a very important part of chaplaincy, the way that my practice actually became evident moment after moment. When you walk in that door and you don't know that person, you don't know what the situation is, you don't know what they believe or what they don't believe, or what they think you believe or don't believe, or what they need in that moment. But you walk in and you meet what's there. So I walked in the door and the whole room is dark. And on the left-hand side, there's a hospital bed, empty. There's nobody in the bed. On the right-hand side, there's a couch. And there's a patient, lying there on the couch. And this is the kind of place where they would let somebody die on the couch if that's what they want. It was okay. It's fine. So she's lying there, and I walk up to her very, very quietly, and because I don't know, maybe she's already died. I don't hear any breathing going on. I walk up very quietly to her, get very, 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 very close. And then I can tell, oh yeah, she's still alive, she's still breathing. But I get so close that it wakes her up. She was sleeping, and it wakes her up. And she looks at me and she says, she looks at me very carefully to see if she knows me, which she probably wouldn't know anybody at that stage of her mental state. And she looks at me very carefully, and she rules out knowing me as a person. And she said, "Why here? Why here?" So I knew that I wasn't going to be able to go into my whole explanation of why I was here, or who I am, or what I was doing, or anything like that. I didn't even give her my name, actually. I just said, "I'm here to give you a blessing." And so she held out her hand, her two hands, and we held hands. And she said, "Oh, blessing, blessing." And I said, "Yes, blessing, blessing." And she said, "Blessing, blessing." And she kept going. Blessing, 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 blessing. And finally, she was sitting up and leaning into my face and blessing me. Because that's the channel that she was on. That's the channel that she was on in her life. So I would suggest that the practice of kindness is a nice channel to be on. In part because the mind wants to gravitate there. So we know from practice that to be present with what is unpleasant takes more effort than to be present with what is pleasant. Sometimes, if I'm finding the breath to be a little bit too boring, I'll do the inner sigh. Oh. Just to make it a little bit pleasant, so that the mind will be willing to stay there. Blanche Harmon used to tell people, sit down with a smile. Sit with a smile. It'll help. At that time, I was all bah, 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 bah. But it's true. The mind will be willing to be, you'll be willing to keep your awareness and your attention aligned if there is a slight brightness, if there is a slight pleasantness. Then it can drop away and it can be more neutral, or it can go into various other states. But the practice of metta and all of the four Brahma Viharas actually are understood to be one of a very limited number of objects that actually lead to the deepest states of concentration. The very deepest states of jhana. So kindness is a very, very powerful tool in the world and in your mind and in your heart. So this is why the Buddha said, it's a sublime abiding, conduces to jhana. And then we move on to the courage to rest in emptiness. Courage to rest in emptiness. So first I should start with the definition, which is emptiness, often misunderstood. I would suggest one of the most often misunderstood terms in Buddhism. So to put it simply, emptiness means empty of something, and the something is empty of permanence, empty of a self, empty of an independent arising. In the Tibetan tradition, often they say, it doesn't arise from its own side. So what emptiness is pointing at, we look at so that's all, those are all the negative statements, empty of those things. The positive statement of that is, it's pointing at conditionality. It's pointing at the interconnectedness of things. So it means something like to begin to experience emptiness is to begin to experience yourself as part of a greater whole. A greater whole that is constantly in a state of flux, but nonetheless all connected through causes and conditions, through a chain of causes and conditions. You could no more be separate from the stars in the skies than you could be of your own hand, of your own thoughts. So what does that mean? Why would that be a resting place? Why would that be a relief? Well, for one, you get to set down the sheriff's hat or the cape or the catsuit or the body armor or whatever your hero attire happens to be. You get to set that all down. Because you know that all things are involved in your awakening. Everything. I saw a gorgeous interview yesterday, a piece of an interview actually, with Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert. So Stephen Colbert is the one being interviewed. Anderson Cooper, I hope I have it, it's not Cooper Anderson, something like that. Okay, good, okay. He's interviewing, and he asks Stephen this question. He says, if you said in a previous interview something like, even bad things, I'm going to totally I'm going to paraphrase here because I can't remember the exact words, but even the bad things are gifts of God. And do you really believe that? And Stephen Colbert goes on to say, yes, I have learned that even the things I would not want to have had happen in my life have connected me with suffering. And by connecting with suffering, I've learned about other people's suffering. And when I've learned about other people's suffering, I'm able to love more deeply. I'm able to know my connection to their humanity. He's not even a Buddhist, although he did say that he was sounding like a Buddhist, right? So there's some really deep teaching about connection that can give us a fullness of life, but also help us step beyond these boundaries that we seem to self-impose exist in. So to be clear, nobody can do your practice for you. I think we all know that. Even the Buddha himself, when somebody asked him to enlighten him, the Buddha said, sorry, can't do it, dude. Not possible. Not possible. You have to do your own work because you have your own set of karmic causes and conditions. That said, this set of causes and conditions is fully an expression of the principles of all of reality. That's why the Buddha also said, all the teachings you will ever need are right here in this fathom body. A fathom is a length of measure, about 6 feet thick. And so the Buddha said, it's all right here. You don't need to go to some other plane of existence. You can, he says, but you don't need to in order to awaken to the true nature of all things. And you have to be able to rest in that emptiness. You have to be able to be willing to be that vast. in order to begin to see what it is that is expressing itself right here in this body. Because otherwise, it's just constrained in this little box called you that you're defending and shaping and trying to make look good on. So you begin to see that it is in fact a small world. It's in fact a small world. And you're completely embedded in it. So part of what happens when you acknowledge interdependence is also a kind of equanimity. Equanimity understood as engagement without entanglement. So equanimity doesn't mean a cool stepping away, nice rigid boundary between me and the next thing. It means being actually fully present for and moved by what's present, what's here, but without an entanglement, without a challenge. So that kind of equanimity, it's again, it's a teaching that's going to sound and look a little different than much of what we hear in society. Robert Thurman, very well-known practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism and teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, said, when you really get emptiness, you're more afraid of hating than of dying. More afraid of hating than of dying. Why? Because hating is taking your connection with another person or another thing or another stimulus and making it into a thorn. Whereas dying is just a simple transformation. Another expression. I'm going to talk more about dying tomorrow. So some of you may or may not think that that's a good idea to come back for, but I'll talk a little bit about it. But I saw this wonderful film, which I thought was a very good example of the juxtaposition of the teachings of emptiness and the teachings of kindness and ethics and meeting the thing itself. So it's a very old film called The Powers of Ten. And I came across it because there is a guy who's on the board of the monastery where I live, Robert Hone, who used to be a science teacher, a high school science teacher. Showed this film to his kids. And The Powers of Ten is a movie about moving physically in space in Powers of Ten and seeing what you see at that place. How does the world look from those places? And the fascinating part is, so you can imagine, so there's a couple lying on a blanket in Chicago Park somewhere, and then you move up 10 miles, and then you move up 10 times 10 miles, and so on. Keep going. So you go out to outer space, and you begin to see the vastness. Way beyond the galaxy, way beyond most of what we can see. When you get out to the 10 in space, it's a very, very, very long way. It's a lot of space and very little matter. But the fascinating thing was that the same thing is true when you go inward. So if you go deeper and deeper and deeper into your atomic structure, what we have learned now is that all those little particles, those little neutrons and protons that we thought were so tiny and all packed next to each other, they have equivalent amounts of space between them. Like football fields worth of space between them in equivalent size. This is what Robert was trying to tell us. So I offer that as an example, again, of emptiness in terms of even the spaces that we experience are more connected than we know. Their interrelationship. You know, it's kind of like in art, right? At first, maybe you see the faces or the trees or whatever's in there. But then after you look at a piece for a while, you might start to notice the spaces also, or the sky, or the black parts. They're equally telling part of the story. They're equally part of the picture. So don't confuse emptiness with space, the voidness of space. That's one way to think about it, but I'm not suggesting that that's our metaphor. What I'm suggesting is that the inner world is infinite and the outer world is infinite. So that could be something for you to explore in your practice. That's why I did the 4 elements with you. Maybe that wasn't something that you've experienced before. So the 4 elements meditation that we did first thing this morning is a way of looking at the body very honestly, right? It's made up of this stuff, solid parts and fluid parts and chemical reactions, those are the fiery parts, and air or oxygen or what. Just looking at it very, very plainly. But the point of that teaching, the reason why the Buddha taught that teaching was to say, and look at the things around you. Notice how the body is a complete interaction of those elements with the things around you. So an apple might be a piece of earth in a sense, and then you eat it, and then at what point does it become part of you? And then at what point does it become not part of you again? Right? There's this constant interaction. Simply the 4 elements in a complete process of motion, of transformation. So to rest in that, to find the buoyancy of that, takes a lot of courage. It takes a willingness, again, to go beyond this sense of being a contained being under control. In fact, the Buddha said that's how we know that we don't have a self, that this body and mind is not within our control. The first time I read that, I totally cracked up. I was like, yeah, I can't even get my hair to do what I want it to do. Of course it's not in control. So the courage to find a samadhi of the interconnection of all things. Whether you do it in the vast way or in the minute way, right? So to some people, practice feels like going in and studying in much more refined detail. That's a kind of insight practice. Or letting go of the diversity of experience and the detail of experience. That's a more concentration style of practice, right? The vastness. In Zen, we talk about it as the dark, the vastness, the indiscrimination of things is the dark, and the diversity of experience, the minute detail, the fineness of things is the light. That's how you often hear it. Okay, and finally, I'm a bit over my time. Finally, the courage to find your freedom. Courage to find your freedom. So to go completely beyond everything you know. Not the small self, not the social self of ethics, not the vast self of emptiness, not the kind self of inner action, but completely beyond all of them. So what do we mean by this kind of freedom? The Buddha described it. So one of the things that I so enjoy these days when I read the suttas, the old Pali Nikayas or the Chinese Agamas or any of those early teachings, is that oftentimes what happens is somebody will come to the Buddha and say, well, when what conditions are present can we say this person is a so-and-so? Or what are the conditions for the first step of awakening? And in a sense, the way that the Buddha always responds to these things is that he says, well, this is what it looks like. This is what that would look like. So it's an invitation. It's an invitation. I think many later traditions attempted to create some kind of maps where you would have an exact step-by-step definition. But the Buddha didn't actually do it that way. He gave us some points on the map, to be sure, but he also gave us an invitation to explore how to get. So what he spoke of as awakening was yata bhutan jnana dassana. As Pali means things as they are, to know and see. So jnana is knowing and dassana is seeing, and yata bhutan is as they are things. To know and see things as they truly are. So that kind of experience of the world is its own benefit. It would be ridiculous to talk about the benefits of that. But I will say this, when Dogen said it beautifully when he talked about in the Bodhisattva Shishogo, the Bodhisattva's 4 methods of guidance, he said, when you leave the way to the way, you attain the way. When you leave the way to the way, you attain the way. So there is a part of our practice in which we are putting the causes and conditions in place, like skillful acts, like kindness, like coming to meditate on your chair, wherever you do it. There is a part of our practice where we are putting the conditions in place. But there is also this part of our practice in which we are asked to surrender to the way that things really are, and to set down everything we think we know about it, because it's right here, and it always has been. This is the good news, bad news of Buddhism. That thing that you are trying to awaken to has always been here. And yet, it's obscured, right? We're confused about it. Even simple things like changes in the body can be deeply, deeply disturbing, confusing. Even though our rational mind knows that it must happen. So to know and see things as they truly are requires a kind of giving And the example that comes to mind for me oftentimes when I think about this aspect of practice, this part of the path, is when I was teaching my daughter Kayla to float. So I learned how to swim before I can remember. My dad taught me, my brother, to swim before I can remember. So I don't remember my own experience of learning how to float in the water. But I knew enough to be able to teach Kayla how. And so we'd get in the pool and you know, I'd hold her up and I'd say, okay, honey, just relax, relax. You just let the water carry you. And she didn't believe me, and it's often like that. You see the kids learning how to swim and they're literally like trying to hold on to the water. That's us in our life. That's us making a self right here, like trying to hold on to the water. But when you can actually give yourself over to the nature of water, then the water won't hold you up. That's its nature. It doesn't take anything. It doesn't care what color your skin is or what language you talk or anything. So this practice is also like that. You put the conditions in place, you get yourself in the water, right? And then you have to give yourself over at some point. There are several discourses in the Anguttara, the numbered discourses, in which the Buddha says, it's not by an act of will that someone who finds joy and concentration in their practice eventually comes to know and see things as they truly are. It's not by an act of will. It's in the nature of things. That's what he says. So by now, I've talked a little bit too long, but also by now, you have probably realized that what I mean by courage is not an aggressive hero activity. Right? It's a noble courage. It's a noble turning to face the reality that we struggle against in the form of fear, or in the form of anger, or in the form of depression, or in the form of drinking, or any number of other forms. In the Mahayana, we often hear about the Mahasattvas, Bodhisattva Mahasattva. So the Buddha referred to himself as a Bodhisattva, as an awakening being. It's a literal translation. And the Mahasattva's literal translation is great being. But that word actually, previous to that time, previous to when it started to become used in the Mahayana, it meant the noble beasts, like the lions. They don't go picking a fight. It's not like that. So I really encourage you all to consider that all of these aspects of the path, these various facets of looking at the same jewel, at the one reality that we're all expressing, all of these facets are things that you can bring into your life right now. They build upon one another, there's no doubt. But don't throw in the towel about one piece of it or another, or say that you can't. Because if anything is made clear by the old suttas, it's that human beings are the people who have done this before. Human beings. So the courage to be upright, the courage to be kind, the courage to rest in emptiness, and the courage to wake up. May you all find your courage.